The occult researcher pried at the final brick, and a hollow clank announced the cavity beneath the manor. A scorched folio slid free and a bronze pendant tumbled onto cold stone. Suspicion tightened behind his eyes as he brushed soot from the pendant and read the single surviving line. The sun eats at the rim of the world. He tasted iron in his mouth and felt a precise, clinical dread, suspicion that the discovery was not a relic, but a live threat that others had worked to bury. He did not speak at first. He lifted the pendant so the candlelight caught the inverted rays, and in that small flare, convinced himself the problem required action. This was the central problem now, a ritual cosmology intentionally erased, and the means to find its living practice. He closed the crypt hatch and led the local antiquarian down the manor steps. The antiquarian's palms smelled of mortar and wet wool. This came from the west niche. The antiquarian, someone sealed it fast. Show me the niche, the occult researcher replied. He kept his voice low. He checked the pendant against his journal sketch of the researcher's own bronze amulet. The pendant's rays matched a symbol he decatalogued months earlier in a grainy marginal drawing. He set the folio on the table and unrolled the brittle sheet. Ink had beaded and run where fire had licked the page. At the temporary study, the archivist assistant lit a new candle and arranged magnifying lenses. The occult researcher tapped the folio with a gloved finger, read this line aloud, he said. He wanted others to hear the words become facts. The assistant hesitated, then read, not giver but devourer. Feed the rim, feed the sun, the words landed like stones. The occult researcher felt curiosity sharpen into a professional insistence. He needed proof. He set the pendant beside the folio and said, "We trace this to a name and we test whether it's still practiced." The assistant nodded and began cataloging the marginalia. The room smelled of beeswax and cold parchment. The reconstructed scribe's voice came through later that night, when the researcher replayed a reading of a copied page. The persona-esque cadence was hushed and quick, the rasp of someone who had written by reed and lantern. The researcher listened and followed a finger along the transcript. The scribe's lines named a rite and a place. Each proper name on the page was a coordinate. The researcher wrote them down. He felt the first emotion shift. Suspicion had moved to focused curiosity. He booked a ride to the village in the morning and stored the pendant in his satchel, under a cloth. At the manor courtyard, a village elder met him on the gravel and did not step aside. The elder's hands were folded like someone who had folded 1,000 hems by habit. "You must put that back." "The elder, you must seal it again." "Why?" the researcher asked. "Because it brought ruin," the elder replied. The elder's gaze slid to the manor stones as if tracing a past damage. The researcher felt the second emotion shift then. His curiosity tightened into unease. He pressed for specifics. The elder named a winter when livestock died, when a fever took children. The researcher listened and wrote the dates in his journal. The elder left with a warning. Some things were buried on purpose. Respect that, the researcher did not comply. Back in the temporary study, the archivist assistant worked at a cipher while the researcher watched. The assistant's fingers trembled when he sliced a fresh parchment to hold the folio steady. He held up a scrap with repeating marks. "This is not straightforward Latin." The assistant, "It borrows rune forms and a cipher wheel." "Show me the wheel," the researcher said. They set the pendant between them to anchor their work. The assistant turned a spool and the pattern clicked into place. As they mapped letter substitutions, the reconstructed scribe's marginal voice threaded through the room, reading aloud phrases and annotations the assistant had transcribed. "Brazier of the rim," the scribe read. The researcher underlined the phrase and circled a place name that matched a ruin marked on an old land survey. Another external event. The cipher yielded coordinates. They traveled that night to the ruin named in the cipher. The chapel lay behind a hedgerow, stone roof half, collapsed, the nave a scatter of mortar and bracken. The researcher and the archivist assistant crouched under the lee of a broken buttress and watched. They brought dark cloaks and a small hand lamp. The researcher felt alert, muscles ready. He kept his hand near the pendant. A chant began from inside the chapel, a string of syllables the reconstructed scribe's voice had once mouthed on the page. They used soft steps to circle the nave and found hooded figures arranging a sun-shaped brazier. The researcher whispered, "Archivist, slow back." The assistant froze and then stepped on a loose tile. The tile made a precise clack. A hooded figure paused. A flash of panic strobed in the researcher's chest as a shadow moved toward the tile. The figures glanced up. One separated and drew a cowl back. The village elder stood framed by the brazier's ring. The researcher felt betrayal like heat. He took 2 steps backward and knocked over the hand lamp. The lamp's flame guttered and rolled across gravel. A hooded figure lunged and the researcher shoved the assistant behind him. The assistant vomited a soft curse and clutched at his arm. The researcher pivoted and, without thinking, grabbed the pendant from his satchel and hid it in his fist. The hooded figures advanced in a slow, practiced gait. One spoke a name the researcher had not seen in the folio but recognized from a parish list. The world narrowed to the brazier and the pendant. The third emotion shift became fear. At the chapel nave the village elder stepped forward and lifted his hands to silence the murmuring. He did not lower his cowl. "You came looking," he said. "You brought a prying mind into a thing we guard." The researcher met his eyes. "Why did you seal the crypt?" The researcher asked. The elder did not answer with history. He answered with duty. "We obeyed a pact. We obey the order that keeps the sun from eating the fields." The researcher felt anger and a new resolve. This was not mere superstition, but an organized suppression. He tried to reach for the folio in his coat and found his fingers were slick. He tasted sweat. The reconstructed scribe persona stepped forward in the researcher's memory as they argued. The scribe's lines had served as both confession and instruction in the folio. The researcher quoted a line aloud, each word clipped. "The brazier must burn the token to reset the rim." The elder repeated it with a small, approving motion. "You heard correctly," he said. "We burn what would wake the rim, burn the pendant." The archivist assistant, voice thin, "Yes," the elder replied, "we burn." The researcher felt the crowd tighten around choices. He could allow the ritual to proceed and watch evidence be destroyed, or he could try to snatch the items and run. He looked at the assistant and read a conflict there. Loyalty to profession, fear for his own life. The researcher tried negotiation. He stepped toward the brazier and put a flat palm on the rim's cold metal. He did not speak a plea. He spoke as a scholar. "You call it devourer," he said. "Show me one passage that ties the right to harm, not protection." The elder's voice hardened. "You test, you lose your place. You test, you call the sun by name." A younger Brotherhood member moved behind him and pressed a palm to the brazier's edge. The brazier flamed higher. Flame ate the oxygen. The researcher watched wax drip from a candle on a shelf and fall into a small bowl of ash. He counted seconds. Dialogue accelerated into a tight exchange. "Village elder," the researcher said, "tell me who swore the pact." "We are the guardians." The elder, "We are the ones who burn." Archivist, the researcher asked, "What did you find in the margins?" "A schedule." The assistant, "A night when the brazier must be fed." "We cannot let them burn the folio," the researcher said. "We cannot let them lose the page." "Then take it." The elder, "Try." The Brotherhood members closed ranks. The researcher moved to snatch the folio. Hands caught his sleeve. The assistant stumbled forward and slapped a palm over the pendant that hung at his throat. His hand trembled and a faint mark, fresh, dark, showed under the cuff. The researcher saw the mark and recognized its shape, a small burned sun. The assistant's eyes did not meet his. The researcher thought he had misread allegiance. A twist had just arrived. One ally bore the Brotherhood's sign. The researcher fought then with short, precise actions. He shoved a figure to the side and spun, pocketing the folio's corner. The elder barked an order. "Hold him," he called. Brotherhood hands grabbed at the researcher and the pendant. The researcher struck backward with the heel of his hand and felt a ring dent flesh on a knuckle. The reconstructed scribe's voice recited an instruction that matched the gesture. "Seize and conceal." The researcher ducked beneath an outstretched arm and ran for the nave door. A rope across his path snagged his coat. He tore free and lunged into the courtyard. Outside, the chapel's shadow swallowed motion. The night broke into motion. Horses stamped, a torch flared as someone chased. The researcher vaulted a low wall and landed on gravel. He heard the assistant breathe his name, "Doctor." The assistant gasped. He did not call the researcher by his proper title. He used the shorthand they used on long nights in the archive. The researcher grabbed the assistant's elbow and ran toward the hedgerow. They reached the manor lane with raw lungs and a bent knee. The researcher felt the folio's edge against his ribs and checked the pendant. It was missing. He had managed only a strip of paper. The assistant's coat sleeve was stained with ash and a small charred knot of thread. They reached the safe room and slammed the door. In the safe room, the researcher counted losses. He opened his palm. The folio was a page and a half. The pendant was gone. The assistant leaned on a table and traced the burned mark on his wrist with a fingertip. "I didn't," he began. He stopped and then said, "I didn't mean to." The researcher watched the assistant's mouth set. He watched the assistant's knee bounce. He wanted names and a confession. He demanded them. "Who else knows?" he said. "Who else binds the pact?" The assistant swallowed. "Names I swore not to tell," he said. He had a new tone, one that suggested conflict between oath and fear. The researcher tightened his jaw and brought the reconstructed scribe's lines to mind to measure truth against ritual language. They planned next steps in terse sentences. The researcher wrote down the chapel's date and time from memory. He mapped the Brotherhood members against parish lists. He assigned tasks: archivist, check parish registers for anyone tied to burial rites on those dates, he said. Antiquarian, find who owned the chapel then. The antiquarian had returned by dawn and rubbed his palms raw. He confirmed the village ledger contained several sealed transfers. Each sealing was a deliberate erasure. The researcher placed the remaining folio leaf under a magnifier and compared handwriting strokes. There was one hand who appeared in the margins in multiple folios. A scribe whose looped Ts matched the pendant's etched rays. The researcher felt an urgency that bordered on obsession. He set up a night watch for himself and the assistant. A week passed with small discoveries and larger obstacles. The researcher interviewed villagers and recorded their answers with a small phonograph. The elder refused to meet. The assistant wrestled with guilt and the mark on his wrist. The reconstructed scribe's persona was read aloud each night to test which lines provoked recognition. Once an old woman, someone with a ledger entry in 1764, stopped mid-sentence and traced a pattern on her palm that matched the pendant's rays. "I saw it once," she said, at a wake. "They brought a son and it smoked like a beast." The researcher noted the woman's name and date. Every third day an external clue arrived. A ledger entry, a burnt corner in an old photograph, an oral recollection that matched the scribe's marginalia. They staged a stakeout at the ruined chapel again, this time with a plan to remain unseen and record. The researcher and the archivist assistant wore patched cloaks and stationed a hand-crank recorder on a bench. The reconstructed scribe's lines were read near, whisper into the recorder to bait any listener who knew the cadence. For 3 hours nothing happened. Then a torch blinked against the hedgerow and 3 hooded figures stepped into the nave. The researcher kept still. The figures arranged the brazier and began a chant that fit the folio's meter. Midway through the chant, a new voice cut the sequence. The researcher turned his head and saw someone approaching the nave door more quietly than a torch would suggest. He recognized the gate. The local antiquarian. The antiquarian halted at the doorway, then froze. The researcher felt a new twist. Someone he had trusted now watched instead of warned. The antiquarian mouthed words toward the brazier, and then lifted a hand to the elder's shoulder. "Stop this." The antiquarian, in a voice the researcher heard through the hedgerow. "You are burning a thing our people need to carry." The elder's mouth tightened. "We carry the cost." The elder replied, "You would unbind it. We hide what we cannot heal." The antiquarian, "We pass the weight in secrecy, so the village survives." Voices escalated into a quick exchange. "Antiquarian," the researcher said aloud, and then pressed his lips to silence the assistant's hand. The researcher saw the brazier flame curl. He heard the faint ringing sound when someone shifted metal with a glove. The mid-chapter mini cliffhanger came then. A figure at the brazier reached into a pouch and produced a scrap that looked like the pendant. The brazier's flame lunged once as if smelling oil. The researcher acted. He burst from cover and grabbed the pouch. Hands closed on his coat. He pulled and stumbled into the chapel doorway. A Brotherhood member struck his shoulder with the flat of a hand. The pendant was exposed, swung on a short cord. The researcher snatched for it, and a gloved hand blocked him. They grappled around the brazier and wax splattered. Someone yelled the elder's name. The clergy of secrecy moved as one, and the researcher felt every breath. He angled and managed to knock the pendant free, but a sharp, quick twist of movement pulled the pendant into a palm, and a torchlight flashed across a face he did not expect. The archivist assistant's eyes, hard and resolved, held the pendant now. The assistant's wrist bore the mark. He did not look at the researcher. The researcher realized with cold clarity that the assistant had not betrayed by force, but by choice. Dialogue exploded into a rapid exchange. "Archivist, give it back!" The researcher demanded. "No," the assistant. "We protect what keeps the fields." Archivist, the antiquarian. "Think what you have done." "I have kept my place." The assistant. "You do not understand, archivist," the researcher said. "You swore the catalogue." "I did," the assistant answered. "I also swore the bond." They traded 3 fast lines that exposed motives and broke trust. The assistant stepped back into the Brotherhood's circle and let the pendant be taken. The researcher lunged, grabbed the folio page he still held, and ran into the night. By dawn, the researcher sat at his table with a kerosene lamp and the folio fragment flat before him. He had escaped with partial evidence and a new set of questions. He checked the assistant's wrists for fresh marks again. The assistant's finger traced the margin where words had burned away. "I couldn't stop it," he said. He sounded small. The researcher held the assistant's gaze and measured consequence. He felt resolve settle into a plan. He would follow the list of names and expose the Order S place within the village's governance. He would not yet trust the assistant, but he would not abandon him either. The chapter's final event arrived as sunrise creased the manor roof. A torn page lay between them, its central paragraph ripped cleanly from the binding. The missing paragraph had a single proper noun, a place name, and that name matched no ruin on any map in the county. The researcher closed the folio, set the bronze amulet he carried on top of the fragment, and wrote one line in his journal. "Find the unnamed place." He placed the journal on the table, thumbed a page, and then reached for a quiet file cabinet. Outside, village sounds began: carts, a crow, but inside the room the folio fragment lay like a wound. The assistant stood and went to the window, pressed his hand to the glass, and then said nothing. The researcher stood and put his spectacles on the table. He tapped the journal cover with a fingernail in a small ritual pause, and then, without another word, went to prepare maps and ledger copies. The final paragraph ends on a concrete beat. The researcher lifted his satchel and drew a map to mark the place that must be visited next. He folded the map and put it into his coat pocket as the first bell from the manor's tower struck morning. The manor caretaker yanked the occult researcher through the chapel gate and shoved a damp, sooty page under his nose. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw. He smelled burned vellum and charcoal on the caretaker's sleeve and read the uneven ink line that matched the pendant recovered from the sealed crypt. This came from the same folio, the caretaker holding the torn page where the partial line peeked out. The sun eats at the rim of the Wu. The researcher pressed his spectacles against the bridge of his nose and answered without hesitation, "Show me the scorch." The immediate problem was clear. The pendant discovered in the sealed crypt had not been an archival relic only. Someone had used its language in the night. Suspicion drove every step he took after that pulled, precise sensation. He refused to treat the discovery as mere vandalism when the same handwriting threaded through the estate. They found the scorch marks where the iron latch met the gate. The researcher crouched and traced the blackened metal with his fingertip, tasting grit on the pad of his finger. He reported aloud, naming details as he worked. The burn pattern runs left to right, the soot flakes in crescent shapes. Melted resin pooled beneath the hinge. The caretaker wiped his palms on his trousers and said, "Footprints led toward the old storage barn. I thought it was a fox." The word fox quickly, like a man who hoped explanation would close the matter. The researcher did not accept it. He folded the torn page against his worn journal and whispered, "Not a fox. Someone carried a brazier or an amulet. Someone practiced the rite." The chest, level urgency ticked in his voice. He moved before the caretaker could protest. They followed a smear of black resin across the yard, a glossy line that reflected the torchlight in quick, broken glints. The resin clung to heel prints that pressed damp into the earth. The tread pattern was uneven, as if the wearer had shuffled to steady themselves. Left foot scuffed on the third step. The researcher, kneeling to measure the distance with 2 fingers, right heel carries ash. The caretaker pointed to a shallow impression where a small, round brazier had been set down and lifted. A ring of scorched straw, and a smear that led into a shuttered barn. The researcher put his shoulder to the barn door and found the latch warm. He shoved until the planks gave and a gust of cold, fetid air breathed out. They stepped inside together. Inside the barn, the smell of burned citrus and old rope hit them. Straw had been disturbed. A workbench bore a wax stain that matched the folio's margins. The researcher spotted a scrap of torn cloth snagged on a nail. A corner of a hood dyed matte black with thin lines of red thread. He held it up. "They were here last night," he said. He spoke low because the barn made every sound echo like a footstep. The caretaker nodded and added, "The latch was sealed again." Whoever left did not want to be traced further. The researcher folded the scrap into his journal and pocketed it. He had rehearsed cataloging evidence dozens of times in his study. Now the catalogue shifted into pursuit. They rode to the village the next hour to confront the local priest. The researcher carried the pendants rubbing in his coat and the torn folio page in his hand. He followed the short lane to the parish door and pushed inside. The interior smelled of candle wax and boiled herbs. The local priest met him at the pulpit, palms together, an expression practiced to calm. "You pull at old things again." The priest, "We have enough trouble keeping the congregation fed and the roofs mended." The researcher set the page on the lectern so the priest could not fold it away with a hand wave. "This scorch came from the chapel gate. This stitch on your sleeve matches the pendant's motif." "Who else knew about the folio?" he asked. The priest's hand twitched to his robe. The researcher named the detail that the priest avoided. "You have a running stitch on the inside sleeve," he said. "Small crosses and a slashed circle under the cuff." The priest glanced at his sleeve with a fraction of embarrassment and smoothed the cuff. "Do not be ridiculous," the priest answered. "That is simply a mending thread. We have no time for superstition." His voice hardened, but his fingers betrayed him. The researcher saw the hidden stitch when the priest moved and the faint bronze glint of a ring at his knuckle. "You wore this at the last midnight mass." The researcher, "The stitch is not accidental." The priest counted his words. "Even if I did, Simon, it is not what you think." He used the name incorrectly on purpose, testing the researcher's patience. The researcher did not correct him. Outside the parish, the researcher watched the priest walk away and felt a shift in his certainty toward suspicion. Doubt had been his first pulse. Now his doubts streamed into a different posture, accusation. He noted how the priest avoided the lane that led to the manor, and how the parish clock had stopped at a time between vespers and midnight. He moved like a man hiding a ledger, the researcher the caretaker when they met under the eave. Their footsteps crunched on gravel. If the priest hides a stitch, someone else hides the text. The caretaker looked at him and said, "We do not tell the council. They'll burn anything they do not understand." The researcher folded his hands, making a small plan with the cold geometry of his fingers. Back in his study, the researcher cleared a slab of desk and laid out the torn folio. He fed the page under a small magnifying lens and spoke the words aloud while the reconstructed voice of the scribe unfolded in marginalia on the damaged pages. The reconstructed scribe's script appeared in the edge of the folio as if invited. The novice acolyte sat across the desk and watched. Breath shallow, read it again, the novice, say the calendrical line. The researcher obliged and read the phrase that pinned the rite to a celestial moment. Alignments of the moon and a blackened dawn. The novice tapped the table. That phrase, my master taught it as an observance. It means the night before the solstice, when the first bite of sunrise appears at the rim. The researcher's chest tightened with a different kind of hazard. The timetable became an imminent event. The researcher invoked the reconstructed scribe by reading marginalia with emphasis, letting the scribe's persona speak through his cadence. "Listen," he murmured, and adopted the scribe's hurried whisper. "We mark the rim when the world tightens. Our hand feeds the sun its debt." The novice shivered and refused to meet the researcher's eyes. "You cannot claim what you read is ritual without proof." The novice at last, "You cannot accuse the priest without seeing the rite." The researcher tapped the bound journal with his fingernail, a habit that punctuated his thinking, and replied, "Then we find the proof. We follow the trail to its brazier." The novice swallowed and rose. They returned to the barn at dawn to examine the disturbed straw in daylight. A discarded hood lay folded by the back wall, and a scrap of paper bore a crude inverted sun inked in haste with the single word midnight. The researcher picked up the scrap with tweezers and placed it under the light. "Midnight." He read, "They mark the hour." He looked to the novice. "Who else reads such marks in this village?" The novice answered after a delay, voice small. "There are those in the priest's circle who come at odd times. Men who help with harvest debts, men who speak of old treaties." The researcher counted names in his head that the novice could not give. He needed facts, not rumor. They followed a thread of footprints out across the frozen field to a ridge that overlooked the hamlet. Moonlight sharpened the cut of earth. The researcher noticed chalk marks on a stone where someone had drawn a circle, and a series of 5 small wedges. A figure moved within the circle. The local priest, his robe dark against the pale ground, kneeling as if in prayer. The novice froze. "Stop." The novice whispered, "Stop and watch." The researcher did not want to be seen, but he also needed to confront the man. He crept forward and called, "Father, hold. Explain these marks." The priest looked up slowly, fingers powdered with chalk. The priest stood and met the researcher's eyes with a defensive fatigue. "You accuse me in the open," he said. "You accuse me before the altar of my own making." The researcher moved closer and observed the priest's hands. They trembled when he spoke, and a thin smear of ash lay along his forefinger. "You laid the chalk circle yourself." The researcher. "You used the same gestural pattern that the scribe notes in the folio." The priest's face registered a staccato of guilt and calculation. "I taught that gesture to steady a trimmer in worship," he answered. "You don't understand the liturgy of this parish." He jabbed a finger at the researcher. "Leaves to feed the poor, Simon." The priest used the wrong name again. The researcher kept his voice low. The novice watched and then recognized a motion from the marginalia. A subtle sweep of the palm over the inward line. "Father," the novice, voice breaking, "you move the palm like the scribe drew in the margin." "I learned that from my master." The one who taught me to bind books. The priestess' jaw closed. In the brief argument that followed, they exchanged lines like planks thrown between two houses. You mean to indict me? You hid the folio's S fragments in the vestry. You second the order. You call the covenant by name. The researcher intervened with 3 short questions that forced the priest back. When did you attend the clearing? Who brought the brazier? Who cast the amulet? The priest answered in small, careful bursts. I was there on the night of the binding last year. The priest admitted slowly. I gave counsel, not rites. A few men came, old families, caretakers, tradesmen. They could protect the village from a famine tied to the coming solstice. I guided them in prayer. That is all. The researcher pressed, guided them with a gestural sequence that matches the folio's notation. Guided them with a phrase about the sun's appetite. How is that counsel? The priest swallowed. They called it the covenant. They spoke of a debt, he said. I was ashamed then. I am ashamed now. The researcher felt his suspicion shift inward, an unease that altered his posture into empathy and then back to resolve. The first shift had been doubt to accusation. Now it became suspicion toward reluctant complicity. They moved toward confrontation at the clearing the next night because the torn folio's calendrical note pinned the rite to an imminent alignment. Hooded figures waited in a ring around a sun-shaped brazier. The researcher strode into the circle and reached for the amulet that dangled on a leather thong around a figure's neck. Hands grabbed him. A struggle snapped sharp and fast. Let go! The researcher barked as a hooded arm closed down on his wrist. He felt fabric rasp under his fingers and heard a small stone clatter. Stop, a staccato voice said from within a hood. The leader pushed forward and spoke a single line from the covenant that no one had expected. The sun must eat at its rim. We feed it to keep hunger from our doors. The words reframed the rite from protection into predation. The leader's voice contained the cold arithmetic of an old bargain. We sought the covenant to avert the famine. The leader said, we feed the sun so our harvests remain whole. We do not worship, we calculate, the researcher answered. You say you calculate, but you use language that eats worlds. Your line appears in the scribe's hand. The leader burned a look and pulled the amulet. The inverted sun flared when the brass struck fire. The novice shouted across the brazier, stop. The alignment is wrong unless the circle's hand follows the marginal marking. There were rapid exchanges, 3 to 6 short lines between the researcher, the novice, and the hooded leader. You cannot tell me what to do, the leader spat. You are an outsider. We are protecting this place. The researcher, no. You hide hunger under a tally book. The struggle turned physical. Someone shoved the brazier and sparks flew. In the moment the brass flared, shapes of flame licked the inverted sun and it pulsed like a small, black star. The researcher felt the air heat and his jacket singe. He lunged and seized the amulet. A hooded hand clamped at his sleeve and the leader reached for a knife. The novice stepped between them and planted a palm against the leader's chest. I am leaving with them. The novice, low and urgent. I will not hand this to a council that kills what it does not understand. A hooded messenger broke from the circle and fled across the field, dropping a scrap with a crude inverted sun and the word midnight as he ran. The researcher followed on foot until the messenger disappeared over a hedge. He returned with a ripped sleeve and a bruise along his forearm. They returned to the study with the brazier smoke clinging to their coats. The amulet lay on the table, charred along one edge. The researcher held it with forceps and found the bronze warm under the lens. We stopped them from completing the sequence, the researcher counting breaths. The novice paced and kept thinning his voice into quick bursts. They were organized. The priest is not the leader. They have families in the village, a ledger to pay for. He stopped and folded his hands. The researcher cut him off with a practical task. List the names you know who came to the binding last year. The novice did, and 3 names mattered. The miller, a cooper named Jacob, and a woman who taught midwifery. The researcher underlined them in his journal. In the smoldering aftermath, they sifted through the embers and found a half-charred folio page and the pendant with a hairline fracture. The researcher recognized the pendant from the sealed crypt. He had pried at the final brick, and the bronze amulet had tumbled onto cold stone months earlier. Now he held it singed again. He felt the emotion shift again, from accusation to a quiet, iron sorrow as he realized the covenant had roots deeper than isolated men. The novice, shaken, said, "We hide these fragments. We will not let them be used to incite terror or power." The researcher looked at the novice's hands. They trembled, but his voice did not. "Then hide them. Catalogue them with a record only we can open." The novice nodded and moved to the locked cabinet. They sealed the charred page and the cracked amulet inside a small oak chest. The researcher watched as the novice tied a strip of battered leather and sealed it with wax. He handed the novice a small brass key. "You will keep this until I return to the archives," he said. The novice held the key like a promise. "I do not want to watch them burn." The novice, voice barely audible. The researcher placed the amulet into the novice's palm and felt the novice's fingers close around it with a short, precise motion. He then turned the chest's lid and set the key into the lock. The chapter closes on the study's lamp guttering as dawn approaches. The researcher counted the men who had been present at the clearing and set their names beside the sealed folio in his journal. He traced a line back to the sealed crypt memory. The pendant had been found in a hollow beneath the manor wall months ago and had been catalogued as an artifact. Now it reappeared scorched at a brazier. He wrote the note clearly. Pendant recovered twice. Charcoal consistent with brazier. Folio marginalia matches local gestures. Priest complicit in council. Village families implicated. He sealed the journal and stood. He pressed the charred amulet into the novice's palm and closed the study chest, the key turning with a deliberate click. The novice slid the chest beneath his cloak and said, "I will hide it behind the millstones until you return." The researcher left with the list of names and the scent of burned citrus in his hair, and he walked toward the manor where the sealed crypt still waited with its brickwork intact. He carried with him a new certainty. The covenant's rituals were active, the village's moral ground had cracked, and the timetable in the torn folio set a new danger that would demand his next choice. The chapel door banged open, and the occult researcher was hauled inside before he could raise his lantern. Suspicion tightened his jaw when the manor caretaker forced the iron ring on the trapdoor and pried. A slate of mortar snapped, a breath of cold air blew upward, and a wax, sealed parchment stamped with an inverted sun tumbled into the lamplight. The researcher bent wiped soot from the seal, and felt the shape of the pendant he had found in the sealed crypt 3 days earlier press against his ribs through his coat. Suspicion drove his hands before any calm thinking could. They had not come for curiosity. The researcher held the parchment between 2 gloved fingers and heard Marta announce, "There are fresh embers downstairs." The manor caretaker did not let him stand. He pushed the trapdoor open and pointed at a smear of candle wax and a faint, fresh ash smudge on the lower stone. "Someone's been here while we slept." The caretaker. The researcher's face did not change, but his fingers tightened around the parchment until its edges crumpled. He had read the scorched folio pulled from the sealed crypt. He remembered the single surviving line. "The sun eats at the rim of the wu." That memory pressed against his choices now. They lifted the parchment under the chapel lamp. The seal bore the same inverted solar motif as the bronze pendant from the crypt. The researcher, "This matches the pendant, the pendant." Marta from the crypt, "Yes," he answered. "I found it with a scorched folio." Marta traced a fingertip at the edge of the parchment where the wax had cracked. "Someone tried to hide this," the reconstructed scribe's voice, recovered from the folio, sounded thin when the researcher projected it into the table lamp's shadow using the recovered phonetic key. The voice read 2 lines in a quick, hissing cadence. The words were clipped and the scribe's breath rasped at the end. Information shifted from static ink to urgent accusation. They carried the table into the manor study and set the parchment on oak between lamp and candle. Marta poured a small pool of clean lamp oil and held it near the page while the researcher arranged vellum fragments. He felt the familiar itch of compulsion, the compulsion to prove a continuity between the sealed crypt pendant and the live marks now appearing in the manor. That impulse moved him toward action. Read it aloud, the manor caretaker. The researcher inhaled and let the scribe's recovered voice flow again. The voice halted at a jagged tear. Where text should have continued, a clean excision had been removed. Marta frowned and tapped the margins. "This was cut out deliberately," she said. "Cut how?" the caretaker demanded. Marta leaned closer, with a razor not burnt away. Whoever handled this wanted the missing line to be absent, not destroyed by fire. She set her quill down and rubbed her own ink. Stained fingers. That implies concealment with intent. The reconstructed scribe whispered a marginal note at the edge of the page that the projection rendered as a dry hiss. Preservation above all. The researcher read the marginalia aloud. "Preserve through witness," he said. The scribe wanted someone to remember. A pause, then the researcher, or to complete it. Marta's hand stopped moving on the map she had been tracing. There is a missing stanza that mentions an offering. It uses a verb form that only appears once in these manuscripts. It implies a living completion. The researcher felt a second emotion move through him. Hesitation that hardened into fear. He set the parchment down and held the bronze pendant in his palm. The metal was cool. The inverted sun motif caught the lamplight and threw a slim glare onto the ceiling. He tapped a fingernail against his journal cover in habit, a measured pause that meant he was thinking 3 moves ahead. His actions showed the change of feeling before he said a word. A sharp knock cut the room's limited warmth. The village pastor entered without waiting for invitation, breathless and candle, smudged. "There are hooded figures on the hill," he said. "A brazier burned through the grass this evening. They left footprints and a pile of charred citrus. The children saw them." The researcher rose. How recent. Fewer than 2 hours. Marta stood and braced her hand on the desk. "Where did they go?" The pastor spoke quickly, toward the old hill. "The path north." They moved like they knew the stones. They would have used the rising wind, the caretaker. The manor mark was on the palimpsest. "My mother kept family seals in the chest. I have seen that mark." The researcher flicked through the palimpsest Marta had recovered beneath the parchment. Under lamp oil, a faded map revealed itself. A hilltop shrine sketched in crude ink and a marginal sigil matching the caretaker's family mark. The map had been overwritten with prayers and lists of names. Marta lifted the overlay and the researcher's heart quickened. Evidence shifted the direction of suspicion toward the manor itself. The map points to the hilltop. The researcher, the caretaker's family sigil appears in the margin. The caretaker's face went pale. He hurried between them, fingers moving as if to defend the chest that housed old seals. "My family has been bound to the manor for generations," he said. "I do not know those who would use our mark. Either someone forged it, or someone within the house betrayed us." Marta. The researcher felt suspicion mutate again. The initial suspicion that propelled him at the parchment had become anger directed at possible betrayal. He straightened and folded the map into his journal. "We go tonight." They mounted horses beneath a low, starless sky. The researcher rode with the pendant sewn into his coat under linen, Marta with her satchel of tools, and the reconstructed scribe's projected persona whispering lines into the lantern light. The caretaker scowled at the manor as they left. The pastor stayed behind to warn neighbors. On the road, Marta's voice cut the silence. "If this rite requires an offering, we are running out of time. Who does it demand?" The researcher. Marta did not answer. She twisted a thread on her satchel strap until it broke. That small motion measured her fear. They reached the hilltop where stone fragments marked a ruined shrine. The grass was blackened in a ring, and a sun-shaped brazier lay on its side, the metal still warm to the touch. Fresh footprints led away into low brush. The researcher knelt and pressed a gloved palm to the scorched earth. His fingers came away with a faint, oily residue and a scent of burnt citrus. He looked up as a voice called from the shadow of a leaning pillar. "You should not have come." A figure stepped forward, hood low and robes stitched with faint inverted sunwork. The Order Adept revealed an amulet at his throat and set his voice like a blade. "The rite is not your concern. Leave the pendant where it belongs." The researcher, "This is not a relic for private worship. People are being used." The adept smiled without amusement. "Who decides what is worship and what is weapon? Who will you condemn today?" Marta tightened her grip on a small lamp. "We have evidence of living offerings." We saw excised lines that demand completion. The adept glanced at the brazier and then at the researcher. "You read scraps and think you understand an old logic. Old things are older than your definitions." This community swore to protect an entity it believed would consume the dying world. "We are not monsters." The reconstructed scribe's projected voice sharpened. "Preserved through witness." The scribe huffed. "You took and hid. You betrayed the order." The adept's sighs narrowed. "They called you witness, scribe. You speak in someone else's ink." The argument accelerated. Voices clipped into quick exchanges. Order Adept. The researcher, "Name yourself." "I am called Jacob." The adept replied. "Jacob." "Marta Jacob." The palimpsest bears a manor mark. "The caretaker's family sigil is in the margin." Jacob frowned. "Family marks shift hands. People change names." Dun T. Dodge. "The caretaker do not blame fate for a traceable hand. My family chest is locked. No one outside, save the steward, touches it." Jacob stepped closer to the brazier, sunlight from the lower horizon searing across his hood. He gestured toward the pendant lying near the brazier's lip. "Give me that amulet. Let it be restored to the fire." The researcher moved. He lunged, not to strike, but to seize the bronze pendant before the adept could restore it into the brazier's ceremonial flame. Marta grabbed his sleeve. "Dun T," she mouthed. He saw the strict shake of her head and the set of her mouth that said they had no right to destroy evidence. The reconstructed scribe whispered a hurried marginalia. "Do not erase witness." A different emotion rose in the researcher now. Resolve mixed with a cold certainty that he must choose between destroying the object to halt the rite or keeping it intact to trace its lineage. He saw the pendant flash in Jacob's hand and understood that either choice would alter lives. He snatched the pendant. Jacob's robe snapped back as he stepped to block. Marta shoved the researcher. The pendant slipped from his fingers and spun across the brazier lip. Jacob reached, caught it, and set his palm over the rim. He began to chant one of the partial syllables the researcher had only ever read in the folio. The reconstructed scribe lunged forward with something like desperate prayer and tried to finish or halt the last syllable. The voice the researcher had used to project the scribe's words faltered in the lamplight, as if the projection itself met resistance. Jacob's chant curved low, and a sound like a drawn wire hummed against the hilly stones. The air snapped. A flame rose from the brazier with a sound that matched a low human cry. The pendant glowed in Jacob's grasp, and a sudden gust struck the group. The researcher felt heat along his forearm. He flinched, and the pendant slipped out of Jacob's hand. It fell into the embers and vanished. The force tore at the reconstructed scribe's projection. The voice broke, and then stopped. Marta screamed, a short, clean syllable, "No!" she shouted. Jacob turned with a face that no longer hid certainty. "You sought to steal continuity," he said. "Now you will know its cost." A shock of heat burned across the researcher's palm, where he had brushed the pendant earlier in their scuffle. He looked down. An irregular crescent had scorched the skin, the mark matching the inverted sun's rim. He tasted metal in his mouth and felt the leather of his glove singe. The world around him kept moving, but a specific, violent pressure had settled into his wrist and reached his spine. The reconstructed scribe slumped forward suddenly, not dead but altered. His projected voice faded to a cough when the researcher knelt and pressed his hand to the scribe's shoulder. The scribe's real body, thin and pale, convulsed slightly as if remembering a pain it had not yet lived. The researcher felt a surge of protective anger. He grabbed the scribe's arm, pulled him back from the brazier's rim, and set him on a flat stone. "Marta, help me," he said. "We need to get him to the manor." Marta moved fast, knotting a strip of cloth over the scribe's mouth and shifting an oil lamp to shield him. The pastor, who had raced up the hill after hearing distant shouts, knelt and checked the scribe's pulse. He breathed, the pastor, voice low, "But something has opened in him." Jacob took a step backward from the ruined brazier. He set both palms out, not in surrender but in a ritual posture you will not understand. "The mark binds you now to the question. The pendant has returned to its hunger. You cannot simply burn it away. We needed it returned to learn where the opening is strongest." The researcher spat. "You used the caretaker's mark. You forged complicity within a home." Jacob's jaw tightened. "We restored what your ancestors hid. We restored what you all feared." The researcher found his voice thin and steady. "Then tell me who took the pendant from the crypt." "Jacob. Tell me who removed the stanza, and why the living offering appears in your rites." Jacob shook his head. "You ask history to be a list of names. Sometimes history is a duty owed." The researcher pressed his scorched palm to his journal and felt the sting with each breath. He could feel a new weight in his decisions. The initial suspicion had become fear in the manor, then anger aimed at betrayal, and now a wrenching mix of determination and dread. Those shifts had shaped his choices at the brazier. Marta helped the reconstructed scribe to his feet and guided him down the hill. The pastor stayed to watch Jacob, who rolled the brazier slip inward and smoothed ash over its face as if nothing had happened. The researcher followed with slow steps, his palm numb, every joint alert. He kept his eyes on Jacob until the adept and his small circle faded into the shelter of a ruined arch. Back at the manor at dawn, they spread out the remaining fragments on Marta's table. The scribe sat with a blanket around his shoulders and a faint trimmer in his hands. The researcher set his scorched palm on the map and opened his journal to the entry where he had recorded the pendant's recovery from the sealed crypt. He read aloud the single surviving line he had memorized. "The sun eats at the rim of the woe." Marta pointed to a micro-script beneath the palimpsest. It was a list of names and an instruction, written in a steady hand that did not match the scribe who had written the parchment. "This could be an enrollment list," she said. "Names matched to offerings or watchers. The caretaker's family name appears here with a check mark." The caretaker flinched. "I don't recall marking anything." "I would not mark a family name for that." The researcher tapped his journal. "We have evidence someone within the house linked family marks to the hill shrine. We have a living mark on my palm." The pendant burned away. "The scribe bears a wound that resembles the ritual's aftereffect." He paused and then said, "We prevented a completion tonight and lost the pendant to the brazier. We did not stop the rite entirely. We delayed it." Marta folded her hands. "The palimpsest shows a map to the shrine and, likely, a ritual list. If someone inside this house supplied names, they altered the course of many lives." The reconstructed scribe, his voice thin, forced out a line. "The marginal note I wrote before the excision, preserved through witness, was my attempt to force remembrance, so someone would ask the right question. I did not intend what has been done. I only meant to keep a trace." The researcher looked at the scribe and then at the caretaker. He set his scorched hand on the table and rubbed the skin with a rag. The crescent mark burned when the cloth passed over it. He felt a quick pain and then the memory of the pendant's heat. He realized the mark served as an index. It connected him to whatever the ritual sought. That was not a metaphor but a fact tied to sensation. Outside, the morning mist burned off in straight rays. The researcher closed his journal and said, "We must trace the palimpsest's list, name by name. We must ask who had access to the chest and who would benefit from directing ritual traffic to the hill." The caretaker swallowed and then answered, "There is a steward. He lives in the village and keeps keys when needed. He has visited families with offers. I will bring him here." Marta collected the parchment fragments and slid them into her satchel. "I will prepare our notes and catalogue the names. We'll need to map each location." The reconstructed scribe's fingers trembled on the table. "If the pendant ate what it touched," he whispered. "Then the ritual wants to feed a change into a place, not just in time but in bodies. Preservation may have caused this." The researcher sat back and let his jaw drop for a breath. He had expected academic puzzles, not people scarred and an object gone. The chapter's conflict had resolved with the pendant lost and with a new evidence mark on his skin. The night had ended in both small victory and a new obligation. To trace names, to test motives, to guard those who might be offered. He stood and addressed the room. "We have delayed a completion. We still have a list and a map. We have a steward to question. We have a mark that proves the ritual imposes itself on the living. We will follow every name on that palimpsest." Marta nodded and slid a clean strip of linen into a box for evidence. The caretaker left to fetch the steward. The reconstructed scribe closed his eyes and breathed slowly, counting the breaths as if to steady a broken measure. When they stepped onto the manor threshold, the sky had lightened enough to show a thin crescent of sun. The researcher lifted his scorched hand to shield his face and noticed the crescent scar glinting in the pale light. It was not an ending, it was proof. He kept the evidence close and the list closer. At dawn the brazier had been ruined and the pendant gone. The final line of this chapter was not a declaration of newfound purpose. It was the caretaker returning with the steward at his shoulder, a man named Klaus, who had keys and answers and a face that stilled when the researcher showed him the palimpsest. Klaus' eyes flicked to the caretaker and then to the map. "I delivered letters to 3 houses last month," he said. "One requested the family mark be shown." That single revelation, a named courier and a traceable delivery, closed the chapter's immediate puzzle and opened a concrete lead. The researcher felt a shift from suspicion to investigative clarity, and then to a grim resolve. He set his hand flat on the table and felt the burn again, anchoring the choice he would make next. The manor closed its doors against a quiet that was not peace, and they prepared lists and questions for the steward, who stood mute in the doorway. The immediate conflict had an answer. The pendant was gone, the brazier defiled, and the researcher bore a new mark. The chapter ended with Klaus saying, "I left a note in the chest for the caretaker last month. I can show you where I delivered the letters." That line turned the night's chaos into an actionable investigation. The researcher shut his journal and wrote the name Klaus across the next page, like a pin on a map. He felt the pain in his palm and, with it, the clear direction of what he must now do. He hauled him up the spiral stair and slammed the lantern against the cold stone when the steps swallowed its light. Suspicion hardened in the occult researcher's throat as he staggered into the tower chamber and saw the bronze pendant laid flat at the altar center. The pendant matched the one from the sealed crypt. The pendant matched the burned line he had read in the folio. Suspicion drove his hands to the journal beneath his coat before the reconstructed scribe could speak. He wanted proof. He wanted to stop whatever work this ring of survivors intended. The room smelled of soot and tallow. The altar's hearth had been partially rebuilt. A ring of stones, iron brackets, and a brazier blackened at the core. Candles had been relit and pooled wax tracked the old sigils carved into the floor. The occult researcher moved with measured steps, keeping his gaze on the pendant, while the manor caretaker leaned against the doorframe, palms dark with grime. The caretaker's face was wet from sweat or rain. He did not meet the researcher's eyes. "Show it," said the occult researcher, and the word landed like a demand. He tapped his journal against his thigh, as if that would steady the tremor in his fingers. "Show me the folio you used to rebuild this." The name like a ledger entry. "Scribe, bring the folio." His voice was low, steady, authoritative, the voice recorded in previous pages of his notes. The reconstructed scribe moved with a bent urgency. He set down a bundle of brittle folios on the altar and untied them with careful fingers. Ink dusted his fingertips. "This is ours," he said, voice clipped. "We preserved the order's wording. We can finish what was started." He unrolled a page and pointed at a line of text beneath the black. "Sun glyph, you call it preservation. The occult researcher. I call it risk." He brushed a fingertip across the folio, feeling raised ink along the glyph's rays. "You know what the marginalia said in the sealed crypt folio. You know the line was cut short. The sun eats at the rim of the wu." He breathed the broken sentence aloud and did not let the scribe finish his thought. The reconstructed scribe's jaw tightened. "We know remnants," he replied. "We know the method. We will not replicate the harm recorded elsewhere. We will finish the rite to set the meaning straight." His hands trembled when he replaced the folio in the pile. He would not meet the occult researcher's eyes. A sudden knock on the tower door vibrated through the stone. The manor caretaker's shoulders tightened. He moved to the doorway and peered down the stairwell. "They've come back," he said. His voice carried an accusation that reached both men. Negotiation had happened below. The cult researcher watched the caretaker's fingers flex around a rusted key at his belt and felt the shape of betrayal shift in his chest. Doubt moved in. The researcher had trusted the caretaker to protect the sealed crypt's remnants. The first arrival was a low, ordered chorus of footsteps. A hooded figure stepped into the landing, followed by two more, and a woman in a matron-assess cloak who held herself like a leader used to giving commands. The matron of the order entered, her boots leaving dark prints on the ringed steps. She carried a small leather satchel and a bronze pin, an emblem of authority. "Matron," the occult researcher plainly. He held his journal open as a shield. "You have no claim here." He kept his voice clipped. He feared escalation but prepared for it. The matron's eyes were dark behind her hood. "The pendant belongs to the order," she said. "You found it. We reclaim it to finish the work. Finish the rite and the purpose is served." She dropped the leather satchel on the landing and glanced at the pendant on the altar with a practiced, cool appraisal. Hooded acolytes' whispers filled the gaps between sentences. One stepped forward and placed a hand on the brazier as if feeling its heat. The manor caretaker exchanged a quick word with the matron in a tone that cut across the room. A truncated negotiation, a bargain finalized on the stair. The occult researcher watched the caretaker's lips shape the matron's name and understood the exchange. The caretaker had been negotiating with the order all along. Doubt leached into the researcher's decisions. He moved closer to the scribe and rifled through the folios for the margins he'd seen in the sealed crypt copy. The surface of the parchment felt like dried skin under his fingertips. The ink had sunk into the fibers. He traced a line parallel to a black sun glyph and found new marginalia that the sealed crypt folio had not shown. A carefully added instruction in a cramped hand. "This changes the terms," he said, voice low and quick. He tapped the marginalia with a thumbnail. He read aloud for everyone in the chamber, each word a weapon, offer must be live, pin to skin. Sun's mouth opens with blood. His throat closed on the last phrase. He had read the partial line in the crypt folio. Here the sentence finished. The marginalia transformed their understanding from symbolic trial to requirement. The obligatory preservation the scribe claimed now demanded a living offering. Silence snapped like a struck metal plate. The matron's face did not change. The hooded acolytes exchanged looks, and one laughed, a short, brittle sound. The reconstructed scribe's fingers stalled over a quill. "Ink spotted the folio. We misread a later correction," he said. "We misread because the original hand had been altered. We can adapt." His voice wavered between defense and an attempt to salvage pride. A rapid exchange of votes and quiet commands carried across the circle. "You see now," said the matron finally, "we knew the rite required sacrifice. You found only pieces. We will complete it properly." She stepped down into the circle and lowered the satchel. The hooded acolytes closed ranks. The caretaker watched, jaw clenched, his earlier collusion exposed. Fear unsettled the researcher's limbs. He felt it physically. The pulse under his jaw, the sweat along his temples, his fingers tight against leather. He moved before he had time to fully weigh the consequences. He reached for the pendant. "No!" cried the matron. Hooded acolytes surged, the room fractured into motion. The researcher lunged, an acolyte shoved with the flat of his palm, and a brazier flare lit the carved sigils. The pendant skittered under a smear of wax and pretended to hide against a stone seam. One acolyte fell backwards, colliding with a stack of folios that scattered like dry leaves. Ink smudged the altar floor in black streaks. Acolyte shouted. Boots hammered the stone. The reconstructed scribe grabbed the nearest folio and slapped it down over the pendant, murmuring a hurried phrase of naming, the syllables sharp and exultant. The matron moved to intercept the researcher with the steady force of someone who had commanded rooms for years. "Stop," she said. "Stop now. The rite must not be interrupted without witness." Her command read less like a plea and more like an appeal to a covenant. The researcher snapped backward and jabbed a finger at her. "Your covenant calls for killing," he said. "Your covenant demands a living offering. I want to let you name that as preservation." He spoke quickly now, letting the words form arguments. He knew his voice needed to function as action. He wanted to stop them, to remove the instrument that would make their promise lethal. "Scribe, tell me you didn't mean this. Tell me you changed it to avoid harm." He looked at the reconstructed scribe, needing the scribe's action to align with his. The scribe met the researcher's eyes, then lowered his head. "I did not write that part," he said, voice thin. "We patched fragments together. Some hands corrected later. I argued about tests." He stopped. His fingers found the bruise of his own inner wrist, where the black sun tattoo lived under the skin. He pressed the pad of his thumb to it. "We believed we could control it." His confession carried the weight of both shame and a wobbly faith. "Control is the dangerous word." The manor caretaker from the doorway. "Control is what brought scorched folios and a missing acolyte in other houses. Control is why we sealed the crypt." He spoke slowly, each sentence a physical set of tools. The researcher folded the caretaker's statement like a map. The sealed crypt, the scorched folio, the missing line that had begun "the sun eats at the rim of the Wu," were all evidence. Another external knock echoed from below. The sound came as a group. A party of investigators in plain coats and official stamps, the kind that searched manor houses when rumors of forbidden rites reached magistrates. Their approach added another dimension to the pressure. If the investigators arrived, they would either arrest or destroy evidence, and the matron had reasons to fear both outcomes. The caretaker's shoulders slumped slightly. His earlier bargain had cost him a clearer position. The mid-chapter air shifted into a stacked decision. The matron spoke to the hooded acolytes in a flat, swift voice. "Hold. We will show them only a demonstration. No one will die." She looked at the reconstructed scribe. "Demonstrate the rite enough to prove our purpose, and the investigators will withdraw." The scribe swallowed. "A demonstration," he whispered, as if repeating a prayer. The reconstructed scribe set a folio between his knees and read aloud a shortened ceremonial phrase. He traced a glyph in powdered charcoal on the altar ring, fingers working with habitual economy. The words he spoke were measured and soft. They retained the cadence of ritual and the terror of instruction. The matron counted in low tones and watched the acolytes align like cogs preparing a machine. The pendant rested on the folio edge, half exposed. The researcher circled the altar and watched the scribe's lips shape each syllable. He could feel the tug. Finish enough to placate the matron and the investigators might leave. Stop them entirely and risk a brawl that would spill blood. He reached out and placed a palm on the pendant. It was cool with tarnished brass, the black sun rays pressed into the metal like a stunted crown. He felt its weight and imagined the line of marginalia, the demand for a living offering, and the missing acolyte recorded in older notes. That image calcified into a single plan: scribe, the researcher, and his voice fell to a near whisper. The scribe looked up. The researcher kept the pendant in his palm and studied the scribe's ink-stained fingertips, read only the introductory lines. Done T complete the binding. Dante touched the body of the rite. Tell them it serves memory, not sacrifice. He tested his own firmness. You can argue preservation without killing. He needed the scribe to act against the order's hunger. The scribe's mouth pressed into a thin line. If I lie, he said, the matron will know. She will see the omission. She will force completion. He broke his gaze. He had the pendant as tattoo under his sleeve, and his throat tightened when he thought of the years he'd spent copying margins in candlelight. If I speak the full rite, we might harm someone. If I lie, I betray the order and they will not forget. He swallowed. The conversation snapped into rapid trade. The matron's eyes narrowed. You will not lie to me, scribe, she said. You will not deny the order its right. You will demonstrate truth. The occult researcher stepped between them and the matron's reach. Matron, he said, listen. If this rite demands a living offering, then the consequence is death. I cannot let you claim preservation as a pretext for murder. He used the documentable terms. Demand offering death. He refused abstraction. 3 back and 4th lines followed, the argument quick and brittle. You overreach. The matron's tone hardened. You deny tradition. You insist on murder. The researcher struck back. You corrupted the words. Then stop us. The matron. Kill the pendant if you will. Destroy the record. But do not pretend you hold the moral high ground. She leaned forward, face close to his, or step aside and let the order finish its work. The hooded acolytes shifted like a small animal pack sensing scent. One stepped toward the brazier and brushed ash with the heel of his hand, as if testing for any flare. The scent of charred citrus rose again as the scribe's fingers disturbed the folio stack. It was a small physical detail that lodged in the researcher's head and pushed him to action. He acted without preface. He lunged, palms out, and snatched the pendant from the folio edge. The matron's hand closed a fraction of an inch behind his wrist. Acolytes shoved. The brazier flared higher as coal fell into a crack, and a sharp line of heat burned across a forearm. The pendant flicked from his grasp, spun, and the scribe reached down, fingers closing on it. The scribe's face was a mask of devotion and panic. A violent tangle followed. The matron slammed an elbow into the researcher's ribs. The researcher twisted and struck, knocking a candle into a puddle of wax that hissed when it pooled against hot iron. Someone cried out. A hooded acolyte staggered back toward the parapet, and the sound of slipping feet echoed like a dropped stone. The brazier lipped. Black sun ink on the folio smeared into a wet bloom. Folios vaporized spots of ink as if the heat took the words themselves. The brazier flared in a way that no one expected. A sudden, small eruption that sent smoke curling toward the ceiling, and a brief crown of light over the pendant as it lay half, buried in torn parchment. The black sun glyph on the altar glowed in reflected fire. For a breath the symbol activated. Something in the glyph's geometry matched a resonant angle, and an ember hummed against the iron like a struck string. An acolyte vanished from the circle then, one of the younger ones who had been leaning too close to the brazier. He was not found among the scattered folios. A spot of ash lay where he had stood, and a smear of charcoal interrupted the sigil's ring. Nobody the acolyte's name at first. The word would have made panic into confession. The matron grabbed the pendant and held it with a grip that shook with rage and loss. Her face showed a fissure. Authority braced against a wound. After the struggle, the room went into a ragged aftershock. The scribe sank to his knees and pressed both palms to his face. The occult researcher leaned on the altar and breathed with measured force, counting to bind the tremor. The Mena caretaker gathered scattered folios and tucked them beneath his arm as if gathering broken plates. The matron wiped her hands on her cloak and tucked the pendant into her satchel. "He is gone," the matron quietly. "We will find him elsewhere." She did not mean the young acolyte's body necessarily. She meant the lost instrument in the ritual economy, the missing piece. The phrase functioned as both command and justification. We will continue. We will leave with what remains. The pendant returns to the order. She stepped toward the stair with the satchel clenched in her fist. The reconstructed scribe stayed on the floor. He touched the spot where the acolyte had been, and then the edge of the brazier. His hands smelled of char and citrus. He started to speak, but the sound failed. He had preserved the right to keep its truth. Now he had watched an acolyte disappear and knew his preservation had a cost. The occult researcher rose and reached for his journal. His hands shook when he removed it. He set the journal on the altar and made a copy of the marginalia that demanded a living offering. He wrote the phrase in his precise hand and underlined the final words twice. The ink bled slightly into the paper. He closed the journal and transferred one folio to his satchel. He left the rest behind, tucked under a stone. He would not destroy every trace. That was not his plan. He would trace the network. He would map the people who kept these rites. Dawn thinned the window slits, and the tower roof began to show the first grey of sunrise. The matron's silhouette shrank as she descended the stair, her shoulders set as if carrying the pendant was the same as carrying a verdict. The manor caretaker followed with a bowed head. The reconstructed scribe did not move to stop them. He remained where he had knelt, rubbing charcoal from his fingertips and staining the fold of his robe. The occult researcher sealed what he could. He stacked a loose slab against the outer door and wrenched a ringed nail into the jamb to make exit difficult. He did not lock the matron out. She had left with the pendant. He arranged the remaining folios face down in a pattern that would slow accidental discovery, and he placed a crude wax seal across their edges with the shape of a pressed signet. Before he could leave, he copied the altered marginalia into his journal again, this time in block letters that could not be mistaken. He wrote the line and then sketched the pendant's shape, including the black sun rays and the small notch in the metal where someone had filed a mark. He pocketed the copy and closed his journal. He would not burn the folios. Destruction invited rumors. He would instead build a ledger with names, dates, and trailheads. The reconstructed scribe rose and wiped his hands on his robe. He looked at the occult researcher and said, "You kept the pendant once. You almost held it now. Why didn't you destroy it?" The researcher set his jaw. "Because burn and bury make martyrs," he said. "Because the order will tell a story. Because whoever holds the pendant holds a claim. I will collect the claimants. I will map the network rather than scatter the evidence to produce fanatic echoes." He could feel the fatigue set into his limbs, but his resolve had a cold shape. "I will trace the matron's route. I will find who else was present when the acolyte vanished." He packed the journal in his satchel. They moved together to the parapet. The tower roof smelled of wet stone and the faint tang of char. The horizon was a thin slash of pale. The manor caretaker had left the main stair and already climbed down into the yard. He paused, looking back once with a hand lifted, not for farewell but to show the exit route he had used to let the matron in. The reconstructed scribe followed the caretaker's retreating figure with a hollow look in his eyes. The occult researcher closed the tower as best he could. He set basic traps. Rolled pebbles beneath the stair, a cleverly shifted mortar slab, and a note tucked into a seam of the wall that would draw any investigator's eye to a false lead. He copied 2 pages from the altered marginalia into his journal and tucked the copies under the lining of his satchel. He then climbed the parapet and looked out at the land where the order had likely parked and dispersed. His final act within the tower was concrete. He wrote down 3 names he would follow first: the matroness' satirical lead, the Maena caretaker's earlier bargaining, and the reconstructed scribe's contradictory hands. He set a plan. Contact a scholar in the city who knew the provenance of similar pendants, check the registry of cloistered households, and send a discreet letter asking for a list of recent charitable donations that matched the order's pattern. He filled the page with precise actions rather than meditative lines. He listed inns, roads, and exchange times. As the sun rose fully, the reconstructed scribe folded his robe and approached the occult researcher. He held out a sheet of crowded marginalia that had been torn from a different folio. "I will help," he said, "not to finish the rite, but to keep the words from being used the way they were meant. I will copy what you need, and you will protect the folios we leave here." His voice was brittle but honest. The occult researcher accepted the folio. He felt the scribe's hands brush his wrist and register the small black sun tattoo beneath the cuff. He gave the scribe a nod. The nod was a contract. They would not accept violent preservation. They would trace what had been erased and hold the record instead of the weapon. Together they would follow the matron's route. A distant cart creaked along the lane below as the matron and her small retinue moved away with the pendant. The researcher watched until they turned a hedgerow and vanished. He replaced his journal in his satchel, tucked the copied marginalia into a hidden pocket, and locked eyes with the reconstructed scribe one last time. "Find names," he said. "Find where the acolyte went. Note any payments to distant houses. Copy every marginal hand that differs from the original. We will map the edits." His sentences were short, commands shaped like planks. The scribe answered with a simple line. "I will start at dawn tomorrow," he said. "I will not lie to you, nor to them. I will record the truth." He turned and descended the stair with slow, deliberate steps, trailing the faint scent of charred citrus and beeswax. Sunlight finally touched the tower stones. The occult researcher sealed the door, set his traps to confuse a casual search, and lowered himself to the parapet to write a single line across the top of a fresh page. "Trace the order. Protect the folios. Do not burn the pendant without an account." He folded the note and slipped it into a hollow in the wall. As he stepped away from the parapet, the sound of a single footstep fell behind him on the roof. He turned. The manor caretaker stood in the shadow of the stair, his hands clean for the first time that night. He did not look like a man who had betrayed or not. He looked like a man who had been asked to choose, and had chosen the order. The occult researcher folded his coat tighter and reached for his satchel. He started down the stair toward the manor, journal heavy against his side. And when he reached the landing, he paused and looked once at the sealed slab that covered the south window. He set his hand on the cold mortar and felt the faint vibration of travel on the road below. Then he turned and moved down into the yard to follow the trail. His plan was concrete: names, inns, payments, and the ledger he would build. He did not speak goodbye. He had a journal to fill and a network to trace. The final beat of the chapter is a clear action. He walks down the lane toward the direction the matron took, satchel strapped, marginalia secured, and the reconstructed scribe already at work, copying hands in the dim tower chamber. The hunt for the order begins now, mapped by ink and the exact words the marginalia had altered. The chapter ends with a concrete sound. The cart wheels creak in the distance, the matron's silhouette half vanished behind a hedge, and the occult researcher's footsteps on the gravel as he leaves the sun tower to follow the trail.